Lisa or Masha can work on this. So probably Cloud would be better.
Okay, I'll do that. Okay, I just started recording. We're missing people here. Okay, welcome everyone. Senbena, daragia kaliegi. Hello, dear colleagues, and welcome to today's event in Indiana University, Indiana University's, Russian Studies Workshops, Critical Conversations in Russian Studies, Buddhism and the Uses of History in Russia. If somebody else could admit people, is anybody else a host so that they can admit people as they come in?
Okay, if you make me a co-host, I can do this.
Okay, I'll do that in a second. So I'm going to, my name is Kate Graber. I'm an associate professor of anthropology and Central Eurasian Studies here at Indiana University, and I'm extremely excited today to have two colleagues and dear friends to talk about their most recent books. So our topic today, Buddhism and the Uses of History in Russia, was scheduled before, long before, in fact, Putin decided to invade, or maybe not before he decided to, but before he did invade Ukraine. And I think we've seen in the last 2 weeks just how prescient a conversation about the uses of history in Russia really is. So our two guests today are Nikolay Tsyrempilov. Nikolay Tsyrempilov is an associate professor at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Nazarbayev University in Nur-Sultan, or what used to be Astana. Prior to his work at Nazarbayev University, Professor Tsyrempilov spent 12 years as a senior research fellow at the Center of Oriental Manuscripts and Xylographs of the Institute for Mongolian, Buddhist, and Tibetan Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences in Ulan-Ude. He was a member of the Princeton Institute of Advanced Study in the United States and head of the history department of the Buriat State University in also in Ulan-Ude. Professor Tsyrempilov has been a very active international scholar. I think a lot of people on have here today already know him and from some other of his international visits. He's been a visiting researcher at Hamburg University, at Tohoku University, at Indiana University, previously in person, once upon a time, and at the Central University of Tibetan Studies, and at the University of Hokkaido as well. So he's been around. Professor Tsyrempilov is the author of several original books in English and in Russian, as well as annotated catalogs and collections of primary sources. His most recent book is Under the Shadow of White Tara, the Buriat Buddhists in Imperial Russia. And that's why you asked him. Yes, thank you for showing it. And that's why you asked him here today. Justine Buck Quijada is Associate Professor of Religion at Wesleyan University and Chair of the Department of Religion there. She's also Associate Professor in the College of the Environment and in Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. She's the author of Buddhists, Shamans, and Soviets, Rituals of History in Post-Soviet Buryatia. This is Professor Quijada's first book, and it's been very well received. It's winner of the best first book in the history of religions from the American Academy of Religion. And she's also gotten this book has also received honorable mentions from the Geertz Prize, from the Society for the Anthropology of Religion, and from the Davis Center Book Prize from the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And I should say too that Professor Quijada was trained as an anthropologist as well as a historian, and so she includes a lot of ethnographic research in her work as well. So these two books were published close in time together in English so that they're available to a wide scholarly audience outside of Russia and Russian studies. Together, they are significant in giving us a more complete historical narrative of Buddhism in Russia that stretches through the imperial period to 1917 in Professor Tsyrempilov's book, and the Soviet and post-Soviet periods in Professor Quijada's book. So that's important for providing descriptive history of Buddhism in Russia, especially Buriat Buddhism, that we have previously lacked in English as a comprehensive view. But the two books are also conceptually linked in arguments that they make about time, the nature of history, and how historical narratives do social work. In Professor Tsyrempilov's book, we see the history of the Buddhist community in the Russian Empire, and the book focuses on relations between Buriat Buddhists and Russian imperial authorities. Rather than looking only to one single central authority, to unpack that story, Professor Tsyrempilov argues that various institutions and actors represented Russian power: foreign and interior ministries, the Irkutsk general governorship, the Orthodox Christian mission of East Siberia, local journalists, and academic scholars. The book reveals the evolution of imperial legislation and specific administrative mechanisms aiming at the regulation of Buddhist affairs. And it looks at how these actors responded to conflicting situations and collisions of interests. So it focuses on the conflict. Thus, the history of relations between Russia and Russia's Buddhist subjects is shown as a complex process with participation of a number of actors with their own interests and motivations, rather than being top-down. In Professor Quijada's book, we pick up with Buriat Buddhists at the end of the Soviet Union, when the Soviet version of history lost its power and Buryats, like other Siberian indigenous peoples, were able to revive religious and cultural traditions that had been suppressed by the Soviet state. In the process, they also recovered knowledge about the past that the Soviet Union had silenced. Professor Quijada argues that as they revived rituals, post-Soviet Buryats encountered new historical information and traditional ways of being in time that enabled them to reimagine the Buryat past and what it means to be Buryat. Through the temporal perspective of a reincarnating Buddhist monk in particular, Dashi Dorjo Itagilov, Buddhists come to see the Soviet period as a test on the path of Dharma. We see through both books that while the history of Buddhism in Russia has often been overlooked, it is vitally important to understanding both Russian statecraft and Buddhist practice. Buddhist narratives are embedded in the history of Russia, and Russian historical narratives are embedded in local practices of Buddhism. So I'd like to start our conversation today by asking a really general question. We have people here who are specialists in Buddhism, but might know very little about Russia. And we also have people who are specialists in Russian history, but know very little about Buddhism. So I'd like to start by asking each of you to speak a little bit about changing relationships between Buddhism and the Russian state. So what in each of your time periods was that relationship, and how did it develop? Okay, and I guess in the interest of chronology, perhaps Professor Tsyrempilov could address that first.
Yeah, before I start, our friend Jargal is trying to get into this session, but he says that he doesn't get approval for that. Maybe you should double check whether there are any people in the waiting room or something, or maybe he used the wrong. Oh, yeah, I see he's here. Okay, so let me begin with the early history. I'll try to say briefly, but if you think that I misuse my time, please let me know. So I think I should start from the first encounters of Russians and the Buddhist lamas that happened in the Volga-Kalmyk steppe in Jungaria, which is nowadays eastern Kazakhstan, or Altai also, and in Trans-Baikal region, which took place in the 17th century. The faith of lamas, right, or as Russian defined it, lamaist, or lamskaya vera, wasn't of course perceived at that time as Buddhism, because the conception of Buddhism was non-existent at that time. So the term itself developed as a part of a long process of intellectual understanding of all those diverse religious traditions throughout Asia. And the Buddhists themselves, it was too early for them to obtain the understanding of the global Sangha, which is definitely the later development, a product of first colonial, then anti-colonial developments, discourse. And the Russian Buddhists will later join this development, but quite early. So for the Russians, the religion was simply a local superstition or idol worship, as they defined it, a relatively advanced form of paganism. So soon they realized that the Lamaistva that the local Buryats were following is in reality a part of a larger faith with centers in Mongolia and Tibet. Sometimes they use the word Dalai Lamstva, Dalai Lamskaya religia. Russian administrators of the 18th century did their best to isolate the Buryat and later Kalmyk Buddhists from the foreign co-religionists, and later even deliberated the total prohibition of this faith, when they realized in practicality of this decision, they made a decision to introduce it into the overall imperial administrative system. So this is what my book about. So is about. So in order to do that, they introduced some changes in the community of the lamas. So they appointed a chief lama, an office of the chief lama, who was in fact not a traditional religious authority, but an appointed religious bureaucrat, so-called the bandit or humble lama. The Buriat Buddhists always realized this limitation and did their best to find a kind of religious legitimacy for the office of the humble lamas. And you can read this actually in Justine's book on the 12th humble lama Etigilov. We can view it as one of such efforts, right, through Etigilov to project this religious charisma to the whole institute. In addition to that, the Russian provincial authority limited the number of lamas, encouraged the construction of stationary monasteries, and later introduced a statute that regulated the relationships between the lamas and lay people. All this was done through following the Orthodox Christianity model, right, as it existed after the Petrine reforms. And the same reforms were done not only with Buddhists, but also with other religious communities in Russia, Muslims, Polish Catholics, Armenian Christians, Protestants, and so on and so forth, with some minor variations. So overall, the Russian administrative structure was based on a confessional principle, as is well known. But what is striking is that the reform I mentioned chronologically happened with Buddhists earlier than with other religious groups, except for, also, of course, Orthodox Church. It's not my observation, it's observation of Paul Wirth, that actually the Buddhist represents the earliest case of the Russian reform of the community to make it closer to the standard of the Orthodox Christian Church. So Lamaiство remained an advanced form of paganism for the Russians until the mid-19th century. It were Orthodox missionaries who tried to convince the state to ban the Buryat religion, to open the avenues for baptism of the Buryats, who first came to an idea that the religion they are dealing with may be somehow connected with the Buddhism they, by that time, they read about in European academic journals. So my book's contribution to the field is that I'm not only describing the Russian efforts to incorporate the Buddhists into the administrative system and their intellectual discovery of Buddhism on their territories. I'm also trying to make the voices of the Buddhists themselves heard. My background is Asian studies, so I can read some Tibetan and classical Mongolian, the languages the Buriat Buddhists actively used. So if we look at those sources, we can see how the Buryats tried to understand the state they had to be loyal to, how they attempted to incorporate Russia into a sacred Buddhist geography. So we can see in the hagiographies of the eminent Buddhist lamas, including the Humble lamas, in travel notes, in diaries, in Dharma histories, in didactic compositions, that Russia was viewed as initially as an unenlightened space, the periphery of the Buddhist world, the so-called dark land. So the Buryat lamas had a feeling of being charged with a mission to bring the light of the Buddhist wisdom to this periphery. So, but then we can see how Russia gradually, in the course of the 18th, 19th century, becomes a blessed country ruled by an enlightened deity, which is the White Tara. So the apex of this reconceptualization is the poem composed by a prominent Buddhist monk who participated in the enthronement ceremony of the last Russian Tsar, Nicholas II. I just recently published an article on that poem, and in that poem, Russia is seen as a pure land or a paradise on earth ruled by an enlightened deity in the human form. So this is the highest development, the highest kind of place that Russia occupied in the traditional worldview of the Buryats of that time. I think I can stop here and let Justine to continue.
Yeah, I mean, so it's really nice to have our books in conversation with each other, because mine sort of, although I'm looking at the post-Soviet period, the story of Buddhism kind of like picks up right where Kolya leaves off. You know, sort of the revolution, and as I'm sure you've gathered from Kolya's book and from what he just said, the history of Buddhism in Russia, the traditional Sangha was always very intertwined with the state, and had not always a positive relationship, but always had a very, right, it existed in dialogue with the Russian state. And so in the period that I was looking at, which is the post-Soviet period, technically like the mid-2000s, the traditional Sangha was recognized by the government at both the federal and the republic level, but within Buryatia, you know, so it's recognized as the traditional Sangha. It has state recognition. The Humble Lama was on Putin's Council of Religious Leaders, right? It does have this sort of special position, but it wasn't the only Buddhist organization in Buryatia. And that was really the first time in its history that it felt itself to be in competition with other forms of Buddhism in Buryatia. So there were other organizations, people who had come directly from Tibet, who had stronger ties to Dharamsala, that were sometimes in opposition to the traditional Sangha, sometimes sort of like to the side of them, but not directly in opposition, right? And a lot of the local lay population either refused to kind of acknowledge these distinctions, or in many cases actually preferred the people with more, the organizations with closer ties to Tibet, because they saw them as being more legitimate, more authentic, closer to like the true origins of the faith. So I think this was the first time, maybe not the first time, Kolya can speak to that, but certainly one of the big features of the post-Soviet period was this feeling that the traditional Sangha was in competition with other Buddhists. And so they were really invested in emphasizing their Russianness, in emphasizing the idea that they were the truly Russian local form of Buddhism that belonged in Buryatia, that these other forms of Buddhism were more foreign in a way, but they had to be very careful in the way that that was articulated, right? They're all technically part of the same faith, but that this was like the more authentically Russian form of Buddhism. And that was really central to the way in which both the Humble Lama positioned himself, the kind of political statements he was making, the emphasis on rebuilding the physical infrastructure of the traditional Sangha, and also the way in which Dashi Dorje Itigilov served as, enabled a way of reconnecting with that pre-Soviet history. As the reincarnation of the founder of Buriat Buddhism, Zayayev, right, the first Pandito Humble Lama. So he was reincarnated as Zayayev, who was the founder of Buriat Buddhism, of the traditional Sangha in Buryatia. And he came back as Itigilov, and then he came back as this miraculously preserved body, right? It provides this kind of embodied continuation of Russian Buddhism that was uniquely Buryat. So I think a lot of what was going on in the ground was related to the way in which the traditional Sangha was particularly invested in being a Russian form of Buddhism.
Justine, could I ask you to back up a little bit, and for people who are not, who are here, who don't know anything about, maybe you're Buddhist studies scholars, but don't know anything about Russia, what is the significance of being an official religion in Russia, and how did one kind of Buddhism, Buddhist Buddhism, become the kind of representative of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, so as Kolya mentioned, the Russian imperial state had a long history of recognizing certain forms of religion, right? Russian Orthodoxy was always the official faith of the empire, But as a multi-ethnic empire, it was impossible for the Russian state and the czars not to have relationships with these other religions. So in 1741, I believe Empress Elizabeth recognizes Buddhism as an official state religion, and that allowed them a certain kind of legitimacy, right? And that recognition came also in relationship to sort of the recognition that Buddhism was more civilized than shamanism, for example. And in the Soviet and the post-Soviet continuation of that, right, state recognition goes hand in hand with state control. So the Soviet government is able to maintain a certain amount of surveillance and control over institutions that they officially recognize. And the post-Soviet Russian Federation has continued that kind of policy in that there are distinctions between what are recognized as traditional religions, which are able to register with the state and have particular rights, in relationship to what are recognized as new religions that are registered under a different category, in contrast to unregistered religions, which, you know, receive no recognition and have much stronger limitations on what they can do. So it is a form of surveillance and control is maybe a little bit too strong. It's sort of like a way of formalizing the relationship between certain religions that are seen as more legitimate than others, and to create that bond with the state.
Thank you. So what I find really fascinating about both of your books is a kind of methodological and theoretical kind of argument that's in there. It's in both of them, really, where, you know, it would be really easy to sort of press on that exclusively, that formal relationship between religious authority and state authority. And that's not exactly what either of you does in your book, because they're much more nuanced than that. So I'd like to ask you about the sites within which these relationships between Buddhism and the Russian state are worked out. So in Under the Shadow of White Tara, this book contains a sort of radical rewriting and a nuancing of what we know about the imperial period, because, as Professor Tsyrempilov was just laying out, he focuses on local archives and records written in not Russian, right? Written in Tibetan and Mongolian and Buryat, and the development of these administrative mechanisms that were supposed to regulate Buddhist affairs in this kind of like micromanagerial way in some cases, so that you can really read against the grain of central archives. And then in Buddhist Shamans and Soviets, Justine, you emphasize how rituals offer spaces in which contemporary Buryats can discover and form different ways of connecting to their past. So you write on page 3, for example, by engaging in Buddhist and shamanic religious practices, everyday Buryats not only learned and produced new information about the past, they were reintroduced to older indigenous Buryat conceptions of time. And so you're drawing here on Bakhtin's notion of chronotopes, and saying, quote, these chronotopes generated by ritual practice offer new perspectives from which to make the present meaningful by offering different ways to connect the past to the present to the past. So how did you, if you think especially about the many graduate students we have here who might be listening to this too, like, how did you come to see these sites? So in Kolya's case, local administrative records, and in Justine's case, rituals as the key to understanding sort of relationships between religion and the state. Oh, Kolya, you're muted.
Thank you. So I think that I looked at the Russian Buddhist relationships more on the macro level, trying to understand how the community as a whole was communicating with the Russian government, represented by different ministries who tried to work out a kind of unified policy towards Buddhists. So this is the macro level. What Justine was doing was mostly trying to look at the same interface on the micro level, how people themselves were perceiving these relationships. What I wanted to say here is Justine's book is focused more on this narratives through which Buddhists try to conceptualize the Russian state, the Buddhist history, and Russian or Soviet period in Buddhist history. I also have something to say here, kind of applying the same approach. I can say that the early Buryat narratives on Russia, as I already mentioned, is the idea of the mission, right? And sometimes the mission was ambitious enough to convert Russia into the doctrine of the Buddha. So, for example, in the autobiography of the first humble Lama, Zayaev, one can find an episode when the highest Tibetan authority, the Panchen Lama, urges him to try to convert the Russian Tsar first, and then the Tsar will bring his people to Buddhism. And this perspective was viewed as imminent, as a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. It is interesting that after the 1917 revolution in the 1920s, during the so-called religious nap, or temporary liberalization of the Soviet religious policy, the Buddhist renovationists, who kind of a group of modernist Buddhist lamas who accepted the Soviet power, tried to advance the idea of the proximity of Buddhism and Marxism, bearing in mind that Buddhism may become a dominating religion in the Soviet state. So this ambitious objective to convert the whole Russia into Buddhism was still in the Buddhist mind, agenda. At the same time, the Buddhist lamas produced a considerable amount of millenarian prophecies that predicted the imminent catastrophe that Russia will encounter in the near future. Such texts became extremely widespread and ubiquitous on the eve of the revolution. They betray the kind of social anxiety that the Buryats experienced in the wake of the administrative reform that abolished the Speransky legislation, and then this aggressive settler colonialism, right, within the Stolypin reform that costed the Buryats a lot of lands. So the idea of the so-called Kali Yuga, or the age of degeneration, was one of the ways the Buddhists conceptualized their history in Russia, inside Russia. And another important development was and I also mentioned it already, was the discovery of Buddhism by the Buryat lamas themselves. It may sound weird, but what I mean is their adoption of the European understanding of Buddhism as a trans-regional global phenomenon. The early 20th century is characterized with the intensified contacts between the lamas, the Buryat lamas, and the Russian Buddhologists based in mostly in St. Petersburg, but also in Moscow. The Buddhologists, especially those of famous Sherbatsky school, were interested in developing contacts with the Buddhists on their territories. So the European Buddhology at that time was trying to overcome the notion of this binary opposition between the ideal standard Buddhism and corrupted version of it. By the former was understood the Southeast Asian tradition, while the later was always associated with Tibet and Mongolia, let alone Siberia. So active interactions between academic researchers and the Buryat lamas resulted, among other things, in reconceptualization by the Buryats of their own Buddhist tradition. So a prominent leader of the Buryat Buddhist, Agvan Darjiev, began to say about returning to the idea of the idealized early Buddhist community, the Buddhism of the Buddha himself. The trope which was never prominent in the traditional Buddhist discourse. So some Buryat pilgrims started traveling to other Buddhist countries and contacted the first international Buddhist organization, the so-called Mahabodhi Society. And the Russians were not very happy about these contacts and did their best to block them. However, the trend gained its momentum and later resulted in the emergence of the Buryat modernist movement, which I already mentioned, the so-called Buddhist renovationism, which called for fundamental reconsideration of the principles of communal organization through democratization and equation of the rights of lamas and lay people. This movement allied with Bolsheviks in 1920s, but in 1930 it was completely destroyed by Stalin. It had no effect on the post-World War II Buddhist revival, and contemporary Sangha isn't sympathetic to those ideas. I'm sorry, I'm again speaking as a historian, right? Giving so many facts. But what I meant to say is this diversity of the languages and narratives that Buddhists themselves used to conceptualize their place in Russia and in the global Buddhist community. It could be done through different ways, as you can see. So this is what I wanted to say. Justine, please.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that I think is the most amazing about Kolya's book is precisely the variety of sources. So you were talking about like the sites and how did we find these sites, right? Thinking about graduate students who have to think about where they're going to work. And to be honest, both of us, I think, right. I mean, in Professor Tsyrimpilov's case, he was, as you mentioned, a curator for an archive and had access because of that, right? So to a certain degree, there's a certain amount of serendipity involved in where you find your sites. Right. So he had access to those things, which is part of what enabled him to do the kind of absolutely fascinating practice of reading different archives against each other. In my case, right, as you mentioned, I'm an anthropologist. I did not actually go to Buryatia to study history. So for me, the site of rituals was kind of overdetermined. I went to study ritual. I went because I was originally interested in what it meant to practice rituals, to practice religion, and to identify as a believer after nearly a century of state atheism. I wasn't all that. I was always personally interested in history, but I wasn't looking for history when I went to rituals. And I ended up finding history by accident. So I would ask people at rituals, why are you doing this? Like, what does this mean? What's going on here? And the answers were almost always about history. So in terms of sites, right, like you find history in archives, you find history in rituals. I think the key thing is to sort of be open to what you find where you are serendipitously located, right? Because you never really know what you're going to find. And it was really remarkable how pervasive discourses about history, explanations about history, right, that were constantly being given to me by even just lay people, mostly lay people. It's like, why does this ritual matter? What's going on here? What's important here? The answers were always about history. It was like, well, turns out I didn't know this, but I learned, and then they'll tell you all about the history. And so a lot of my book came out of just trying to make sense of the historical narratives that people were telling me when I was talking to them about rituals. So the site was very serendipitous in my case.
I think you both just touched on this really amazing, remarkable feature of both of your books, that there's this incredible multiplicity of narratives that, and as Kolya was just saying, this is a really nice corrective to the notion that there's a Buddhist conception of time even. That there are multiple possible narratives and multiple possible ways of imagining time, chronotopes at the same time. And I think that's something, I want to ask you about this. I want to ask you about different conceptions of time here, because it's one thing, I think everybody who thinks about history for more than 5 minutes can agree that we can all agree that the same event can be remembered in different ways. That's not a complex point. But I take your arguments to be about time to be something different than this, that there are these overlapping possible chronotopes available to evoke in different moments as strategic resources, and as ways of applying different explanatory frameworks to unfolding events or to things that you want to have happen as well, right? So then controlling historical narratives becomes not a matter of fixing what happened in the past, but rather of selecting and fixing particular temporal orientations and whatever suits the particular moment, or as maybe a Buddha would say, using skillful means in your temporal selection, right? So as an anthropologist, I have to ask you about the extent of your relativism on this point. So when there's a conflict between temporal orientations, what, if anything, is the kind of shared ground? Is this, is everything just flying off like, oh, anyone can make anything mean anything? Anything? Like, what is the shared ground that you found in your time periods and in the discourses that you were looking at?
Do you want me to take that one first, Kolya?
Yeah, sure, please.
Yeah, it is kind of a tricky question. It's a really good question. And I think, honestly, there weren't a whole lot of conflicts about temporal orientations. I found that people, to borrow a term from linguistic anthropology, right, which is your specialty, people code switched fairly easily. So people would use, I found people could use a very Soviet linear narrative of progress in one context and then switch really easily into a Buddhist narrative of reincarnation and or prophecy. But I guess one of the things that would count as shared would be there was relatively little disagreement about certain events happening. And that's something that is perhaps different from other contexts where we see arguments about history. People weren't arguing about certain things happening. They might disagree, not so much disagree, like their narratives would sometimes include very different events. I found, for example, like shamans' narratives of history had very different events in them than Buddhist narratives of history. But for example, things like, Kolya was talking about the renovationist movement at the beginning of the Soviet period, right? Nobody would disagree that happened. People didn't disagree that the purges had happened, but they would fundamentally disagree with how they talked about them in terms of what they meant afterwards. But there wasn't necessarily a lot of conflict over disagreement. It was more like that served as a resource for different ways of thinking about what was going on in the present and how to make the present meaningful in relationship to the past. But they didn't seem there didn't seem to be a lot of disagreement about that so much as a like live and let live approach to it. But so, for example, right, the idea that Stalin's purges happened, right, everyone agreed that they happened. The question was, what did it mean, right? Was this a necessary price to be paid for modernity that then allowed Stalin and Russia to defeat the Nazis in World War II? Was this... so, for example, in like Caroline Humphrey's argument about Stalin in her article about Stalin and the Blue Elephant, right, was that the karmic working out of Stalin's previous incarnations that he had to, experience this? Was this the result of bad karma that had been built up before? Or did, as some of the shamans that I talked to, were the negative actions of people during the purges, did that produce illness in families now in the present, right? Everyone agrees that this is a significant event, but then there were lots of different ways to argue about how it mattered in the present. But I didn't find that people necessarily, it didn't produce conflict. It was more like a conceptual resource. And Buddhism, I think, is very, very rich as a conceptual resource for rethinking time, because it has these mechanisms of karmic weight, because it has traditions of prophecy, right? Kolya was mentioning the way in which prophecy became a really big thing around the early Soviet period with the renovationists, right? Prophecy suddenly reconfigures the present in relationship to the past in a way that just really isn't there in a linear narrative of progress. And then you have the possibility of reincarnation, in which single people can become actors in multiple time periods, right? So all of that allows time frames to kind of become flexible and fluid. So I guess what grounds it is like an agreement that these events happened. That doesn't, and that is a very real grounding, right? Like these are real events. But I will note it is different. I found it difficult to integrate this kind of approach with memory studies, because in a former Soviet context, and I think more broadly in indigenous contexts, it's not just what's remembered that matters, it's also what's forgotten. So the idea that the state can erase certain narratives, that state violence produces forgetting, that's also really important to the narrative. And so memory focuses, at least for my analysis, memory studies focuses a little bit too much on how people remember, which of course is part of this. But what I found to be really significant were the practices of recovering that which is lost or silenced. And so the sort of historical details of like, we found this in the archives, we found these dead ancestors in the census reports, right? That materiality of history being real in a way that memory studies doesn't really necessarily grapple with, that was really important to the practice of reconfiguring time. So it was a really creative blending of like, right, people would use the religious practice to kind of like say this is why it mattered, but they would use historical archival practices of finding ancestors in census records, finding documents and memos to kind of make this materially real. So it's a very complicated way of reworking the past. I don't know if that really answers the question. It maybe just complicated it. Kolya, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. It's very interesting, Justine, what you say about these narratives of history. I just wanted to add to direct your attention to the idea that in my understanding, there is no one unified Buddhist narrative of history. Of course, there's a diversity of different narratives that may be recognized as Buddhist or inspired by Buddhist philosophy, by Buddhist thought. Maybe we can see that sometimes in some cases it's extremely problematic to distinguish or to make a dividing line between the kind of true Buddhist narrative and simply a traditional kind of conservative morals of the Buddhists, say, of the 19th century. When you are reading some didactic treatises written by the Buryats, you simply cannot say what is more in it, Buddhist ideas or simply the resistance of tradition to the advancing modernity. And the same with the prophecies. As I said, it's easy to recognize this feeling of anxiety of the Buryats, who were losing their old world and facing this new reforms, new rules, new regulations, and it simply manifested in the forms of Buddhist prophecy. And I already told about these modernist views of history, right? When, say, Agwan Darjiv is thinking that Buddhist Sangha should return to its kind of golden age, to the time of the Buddha, being under definitive kind of impact of influence of the academic Buddhology in Russia. So there is diversity of different Buddhist narratives, and sometimes it's very hard to distinguish between what is real Buddhist, or what is simply kind of voice of tradition in a general sense, I would say.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating discussion. And it reminds me too of Manduhai Buyandelger's work on silenced stories, right? Like which stories or which narratives do not appear in ethnographic records or in historical records because they've been silenced by the state, which is exactly to Justine's point, but I think also to Kolya's, that there are multiple narratives available at any given time, but some that are not available at all to be used because they've already been silenced in some way too. So I want to make sure that we have time to for people here who are also participating in this conversation, but are not me asking questions, to ask questions. So you can put any questions you'd like in the chat. I'm going to ask one more big meaty question of our two guests here, but and then I'll moderate any questions that you'd like to ask in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I'll call on you too. That's also possible. So I have to ask this one last question about embodiment, because it's so central to both of your studies. This notion of investing, or this practice rather, of investing human bodies with religious significance and of co-opting bodies into narratives that are both historical and cosmological in scope. So in Professor Tsyrempilov's book, we see how Russia is conceived over time, is conceived to be a part of Buddhist sacred cosmology and sort of brought in, with Moscow figuring increasingly as a Pure Land, and with the Romanovs being, their bodies being kind of co-opted into this discourse by thinking of them as embodiments of white Tara. And in Professor Quijada's book, especially through the body of Idagilov that we've already discussed a little bit, and then she gave a kind of overview of. And this is also something that Anya Bernstein discusses at length in her book on Buriat Buddhism, Religious Bodies, Politics. So there's clearly something, important here. Why do you think bodies have become the locus of so much social anxiety, historical anxiety, and attention in Russian Buddhist history, or Buriat Buddhist history, if you like?
Well, I can start answering your question. Well, I consider the phenomenon of Idagilov, which Justine is discussing in her book, as I said already, as an attempt of the office of the Pandit Humble Lama to transform the institute of the chief Buddhist priest from the kind of bureaucratically state-appointed person to a charismatic authority. So I'm not ready to discuss whether the body of Idagilov is a miracle or not, but the current Humble Lama never missed this chance to advance the idea that the Buryat Sangha was and is governed not by religious state-appointed bureaucrats, but by the sacred figures. And in this sense, Idagilov's body is the crucial point. I think for the first time in the history of this institute of Pandit Humble Lamas, the case of Idagilov was this turning point of transforming the whole office into the kind of charismatic authority. As for the body politics, what I find especially interesting is how the tradition of to imagine Romanovs as embodiments of the white Tara that I mentioned in my book, white Tara goddess, was so easily transformed into the assumption that the elected presidents, Medvedev or Putin, doesn't matter, may become bodily containers, right, for the spirit of the enlightened deity. So it is not limited to the Romanovs dynasty and may easily transfer to the elected president. There are a number of questions that people ask. So when Medvedev stopped being a president, does it mean that the spirit of white Tara abandoned his body and moved to Putin's body? Or what's going on, right? I think that the whole idea is in this intellectual crisis, whether it's what I may seem too cynical today, but again, I consider it as an evidence that the Buriat Buddhist circles, consciously or not, use these discourses to secure their political objectives, right? To survive in the initially unfriendly ideological environment of Russia for Buddhism, right? And promote the Buddhist cause. And in this sense, this interplay between body and charisma, body and the sacred spirit of the deity played a very important role.
Yeah, I mean, I also really should just say so much of my thinking about Dashi Dorje Itigilov came out of conversations with Professor Tsyrempilov, right? That we had when I was in the field. So yeah, I mean, embodiment, I agree with everything that you just said. I think that there are two different aspects to the embodiment, right? There's the question of embodiment in relationship to these charismatic leaders, um, like seeing the Romanovs or Medvedev as embodiments of white Terra, seeing the Pandito Homolama as bearing this particular kind of embodied charisma. There's also the way in which embodiment works through ritual to make certain things real for the lay participants. So I think a lot of that has to do with what Kolya just said about potentially hostile environments, right? These are not necessarily institutions that have a lot of power in their ability to structure the conditions of everyday life, right? Buddhism has always been, and the traditional Sangha has always sort of been somewhat at the mercy of the state, and has had to negotiate that difficult position, and so making their claims real through embodied experience is very much part of that, right? You have to, for something to be real, and people talked about it that way as well, right? Like, I know this to be true because I felt it. Itigilov is powerful because he had an impact on my body, on my physical state of being, and therefore I believe, right? That way of making things real through the ritual experience, I think, was very crucial to people's experience, and also really important because these are not necessarily the most powerful institutions, and so every little bit helps, I suppose, in terms of establishing the reality of the claims that they're trying to make, and the political positions that they're trying to occupy, and political goals they're trying to achieve.
So we have a question in the chat from that's really for both of you, from Kenny Linden. Regarding different historical interpretations and times, how do you handle the fact that some people's interpretations are inaccurate and contradict established facts? This is a historian's question. What degree of subjectivity do we allow before we as scholars step in, not to correct people real time necessarily, but at least in publications and scholarly discourse? No one wants to. That's a hard one. That's a hard one, especially if you're both a historian and an ethnographer, or if you're reading multiple sources, as Kolya was for his book, right? That there are occasionally you will come across times when people are directly contradicting things that otherwise seem to be established facts. Justine already brought up the example of the purges being something that everyone agrees happened, at least in some form, but maybe you could think of a different example where where there really is a sort of contradiction with something that you know to be true as a historian from other sources.
I mean, I personally, as an ethnographer, just sort of sidestep the question. I actually have a disclaimer in the introduction to my book that I am not attempting to establish the historical accuracy of any of the events claimed. Anything really egregious, I probably would have put in a little footnote that says actually. But yeah, I mean, as an ethnographer, I get to kind of dodge that question because I'm really more interested in the rhetorical effect of making the argument. And I think that those gaps, right, are where the really productive interpretations come from. But yeah, I mostly just kind of dodged that one. But Kolya, as a historian, right, doesn't have that luxury. So yeah, how do you handle that?
Well, as a historian, I frequently encounter with very arbitrary interpretation of history on, say, the side of the official Buddhist Sangha, or what the Khambo Lama usually says about the sequence of events, about different events that have no actually confirmation from any historical source, but still are portrayed as an established fact. It happens all the time, you know, that there is actually no sense to question these interpretations, because as the Buddhist authority, the Khambo Lama, of course, has his own right to establish his own view, right, of how the Buddhist Sangha was developing, and he has this privilege actually not to support his arguments with any sources, because you know, he can always simply say that this is what he knows from oral sources, or what he had seen in his meditation. So yes, there's a variety of interpretations, and in the field of Buddhism, from the side of believers or official Buddhist circles, one of the such kind of misconceptions that is reiterated by so many, say, academic scholars in many academic papers, that say Empress Elizabeth recognized Buddhism in 1741. There is no such document that confirms that, but still this is so established that I wrote a paper on this, but the conclusion of the paper is that we cannot prove this, but we also cannot disprove this, right? It all depends on your perspective, how you view this episode. And there are a number of such things. The same is with the Kathryn the Great to be the embodiment of the White Tara, which is even in the title of my book, but actually that episode is also not confirmed by any historical document. It was simply has no documentary evidence at all, right? But it is so established, it's in the folklore tradition. So Buddhists simply believe in it, and this is the fact that you cannot question. Simply, this is the simple fact.
Could you comment? We have another question on the chat on a different topic, but could you comment briefly on how, to what extent is it your responsibility as a historian of Buddhism, especially when there's so little research done in this field? To what extent is it your sort of obligation to responsibility to unearth every single darn interpretation and narrative, versus looking at the ones that have come to the fore and have been established, as you say, just sort of through the sheer force of repetition? And yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Like, what's your take on when you should pay attention to something and include it in your publications or bring it forward, and when you should sort of allow it to be sort of silenced or exclude it from your study?
Well, I simply honestly say that this episode has no documentary evidence, right? It's simply it's a part of, say, oral tradition, right? But not of the historical documents. But at the same time, I do recognize that if a certain episode has no documentary evidence, doesn't mean that these documents do not exist, right? For example, the decree of Elizabeth may exist, but simply we still haven't yet found it. You know that the Buddhist archives are very problematic. They are scattered throughout different state archives in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in Ulan-Ude, in Irkutsk, in Chita. A large portion of it simply perished in fires. Say in Irkutsk, there was a huge fire in 1870s when almost entire early 19th and 18th century archives simply perished because of that. And some archives in, say, in St. Petersburg and Moscow are, I mean, the Buddhist papers are simply in mass. They are not centralized in one place. And I found some important documents simply by chance, and I simply assumed that my responsibility simply say that nowadays we have no documentary evidence for supporting that fact, but it, of course, does not mean that this fact is absolutely untrue from a historical viewpoint. But I know that anthropologists, of course, have different approaches. They're more maybe, I would say, receptive and sensitive towards what people say, and what different authorities, like, for example, official Buddhist Sangha, have the right to claim, right, without any evidentiary documentary evidence. So this is a different approach. So I'm speaking here from the viewpoint of an academic researcher.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. We have a question specifically for Professor Quijada. Would you, this is from Joey Cleveland, would you be able to comment on Soviet science, Buddhism, and the different temporalities they index through Idigilov's body?
Sure. I'll try and do it relatively quickly because I know there's some other questions in there. But it's kind of hard because there's a lot going on there. I think for me at least, one of the main things that Idigilov's body was able to do for reconceptualizing Buddhist history and the idea of temporalities, right, on the one hand, so the narrative, for those who haven't heard about this, who haven't read about it, the overall narrative is that Idigilov was, one of his reincarnations was as Pandito Hambalama Zayayev, who was the first Pandito Hambalama of Buryatia. He was then reincarnated as Dashi Dorji Idigilov, who was the Pandito Hambalama for the traditional Sangha in the last years of the Romanov dynasty, so right around the period of the revolution, right before the revolution. And he then did special meditations on and miraculously preserved his body. There's a huge debate over, as Kolya mentioned, right? We don't want to get into like, is he bodhisattva? Is he miraculously preserved? Is he still alive? Is he still dead? He's ontologically uncertain, and his body was dug up basically, and now resides at the Ivolginsky Datsun outside of Ulan-Ude, and the miraculous condition of his body, which has been verified through scientific tests, a limited number of scientific tests, I will note, but nonetheless has been verified through certain scientific tests, is touted as scientific proof of the miraculous sort of state of his body and the condition, and kind of positions Buddhism and his ability to preserve his body as proof that Buddhism is more powerful than science, right? It is presented a mystery that science cannot explain, and so science in effect authorizes the power of Idigilov's miraculous self. At the same time, this relationship to science allows people kind of this. So on the one hand, it takes science, which is, central to what the Soviet state argued it was giving to Buryatia, right? The Soviet state is bringing civilization, it's bringing science, it's bringing modernity and progress. And now that science is being used to prove that Buddhism kind of offers this more powerful alternative. But it also gives people an entry point into Idigilov's life and his own scholarship. He was a tremendous scholar of Buddhist philosophy, and to pre-Soviet Buddhist scholarship more broadly that was existed under the auspices of the traditional Sangha and in dialogue with a broader Tibetan and Mongolian Buddhist world. And so it in effect allows Buddhists, not just the traditional Sangha, but I think Buddhist scholars more broadly and historians to recover an indigenous tradition of scholarship and philosophy and medicine that existed before the Soviets came, and which the Soviets worked very, very hard to silence. So his existence as this like miraculous body that is authorized, and his miraculousness, right, is proven by science. That's the phrase that the Pandito Khambo Lama uses all the time, right? He is the scientifically proven miracle. That opens up this whole other perspective on the existence of a sort of more authentic and pre-Soviet Buryat academic and scholarship that existed in this world. I think that probably is the fastest way to kind of lay it out. There's so much going on there.
Your discussion there of scientific fact is so closely related to the earlier discussion of historical facts, right? And whether or not it's a disciplinary perspective in a way, like that the anthropologist and probably the historian too are more concerned with looking at the debate over what counts as an explanatory framework or as legitimating authority, as opposed to deciding whether or not Itakilov is a phenomenon or not, right? Like that's the biologist is concerned about that, but perhaps not the anthropologist or historian to the same extent. We have a question for both of you from Tatiana Chudakova. I'm curious if either of you would be willing to comment on the messy boundary between authorized/unauthorized or official/unofficial, or any other seeming binary along those lines. In other words, the plurality of narratives seems to have a really interesting relationship to authorization, not necessarily matched to an alignment with the state. I'm thinking specifically of Bidya Dandarovich Dandaran and the way in which the state repressions against him and his followers functioned kind of as a form of authorization or validation. He was legitimated through those, in some ways, through those repressions. Right? I'm reminded of how people in Buryatia during my own fieldwork chose to align with or actively sidestep the official Buddhist Sangha's position. So in other words, is this toggle of recognized, unrecognized a kind of binary that obscures more than it reveals? I guess this is a methodological question.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, especially if we look, if we realize that the Buddhist Sangha in Buryatia is itself in a very, I would say, ambiguous position. Being, of course, important authority for local Buriat Buddhists, but at the same time being very often in opposition towards what, say, the Dalai Lama says, right, or to the Kalmyk Lama, right? The political orientations of the current Khambo Lama and, say, the Lama of the Kalmyk people are absolutely different. And so the Khambo Lama understands this ambiguity and simply relies more upon those people who are loyal, who are more traditional, for whom the Buddhist Sangha is always was the main authority. And I think that for him, the Etigelov's phenomenon was that magic wand, I would say, right, that made the whole institute not simply authoritative in the eyes of the local Buriat Buddhists, but also internationally relevant, right? As Justine says in her book, the phenomenon of Etigelov was unique in the sense that it was officially kind of, again, I use the word official, which is problematic, I do understand, but still it was scientifically tested, right? Although there are some questions about the authority of that body that made tests, right? I think that the results were never published in any academic journal, and so on. But for the Buddhists who understand from Soviet time, they used to take the authority of science. For them, it's a kind of additional legitimation, not only of Etigilov, not only of the whole institute of the Humble Lamas, but also of the Pandita Humble Lama Ayushev himself. So I think he raised his status significantly, right, after 2002, when the phenomenon happened. And I think that it plays a role. I mean, this binary opposition between what is official and what is unofficial plays a role, because the unofficial side is too diverse. We have so many Buddhist organizations in Buryatia, and some of them may say some weird and strange things from the viewpoint of the believers. For example, one of the Buddhist lamas claims that Etigilov is simply a salted dead body, and worshiping him is a stupid thing, is the stupidest thing that may happen to a real Buddhist. But of course, such claims, such statements do not help to raise the authority of that person in the Buddhist community of Buryatia, because the Etigilov already occupied a very, I would say, central place, right, in the pantheon of Buddhist saints. So yes, I think that this authorization, this authority of the Buddhist lamas comes not only from the state sanction, right, from say association of Ayushev with Putin, but also from this absolutely unexplained, unconceivable phenomenon of Etigilov's body, right, which is kind of proof of sanctity of the whole institute, and Ayushev, including Ayushev. I could say also something on Dandaron, but I think we don't have time for it. It would be good to have a different separate discussion on Dandaron.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add really briefly, I think the question, so recognized, unrecognized, official, unofficial, from a methodological point, is always a question of like recognized by whom, official in whose eyes, right? And I think one of the things that Kolya pointed out is, right, there's also recognized or authorized by popular opinion of lay people. The opinions of the lay believers and participants are really important as well. So, you know, this is such a fascinating topic to work on, because there are so many players on the table, right? So there's the, you know, we say the state, right? But the state is, there's the federal state, there's the republic state, there's, you know, various different state actors in Mongolia or Kalmykia, for example, that are also part of this negotiation. And we have, right, the traditional Sangha, different Buddhist institutions. We have occasionally the Dalai Lama will say something who doesn't even necessarily think about the Buryat context, but then is authorizing certain claims in Buryatia. And then you have the way in which people respond to that, right? All of those are different claims to being official. All of those are different ways of authorizing particular claims. So official, unofficial, recognized, unrecognized, always, right? I do think being unrecognized can be enormously authorizing in other audiences, right? So it's always like authorized by who, to whom, right? For what purposes, right? As long as we make sure we remember that those are embedded in you know, then methodologically they become really, really useful. But we can't ever treat them as like static categories, right? They're always sort of these relational binaries, I think. Yeah, and Dandaron is of course a great example of that, and I agree with Kolya. Like we need a whole separate event about Dandaron.
That'll be part 2. part 9. We could continue this conversation probably indefinitely, because there's so much in both of these books. It's so rich for scholars of Russia, for scholars of Buryatia, for scholars of Buddhism. So I hope if you are in our conversation right now and you haven't read both of these books, that you'll go check them out now. We need to wrap up just in the interest of time, but I think I'll be here. I'll stop the recording, but I'll be here for another 15 minutes. And I think our guests might be here for a little while longer as well, if you'd like to stick around. But I'd like to stop the recording and thank Maria Fokina and Lisa Bidwell for their assistance in arranging this event, and the co-directors of the Russian Studies Workshop, Tatiana Saburova and Sarah Phillips. Thank you to our guests especially, and to everyone for this wonderful conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for organizing this.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting us and for engaging with our work and coming to listen to us. It's a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Absolutely a pleasure.